Now let me talk briefly about Walt Whitman, an American. Walt Whitman was born on Long Island, New York in 1819 and raised in Brooklyn. His mother came from a family of Dutch horse breeder, and his father was descended from English Puritans who had farmed American soil for a century and a half. Whitman left school at the age of 11 and worked as an office boy in Brooklyn, New York, where his family moved in 1823. In 1831, he went to work for Samuel Clemens, the printer and editor of the Long Island Patriot. Like other American writers such as Mark Twain and Ernest Hemingway, Whitman got much of his education from his newspaper work, first as a type compositor and then a journalist and editor. But New York was not a source of wealth for an uneducated, self-conscious youth. After a few months, Whitman went back to Long Island. He stayed there until he was 22 years old, living with his relatives, intermittently teaching schools, delivering papers, and contributing pieces to the Long Island Democrat. In 1841, he returned to Brooklyn. At the age of 23, he became the editor of the Daily Order. As a reporter, he promenaded Lower Broadway, spent much time in the theaters, cultivated the opera, and flirted with the street corner politics. In early 1848, Whitman left New York and became a special writer on the staff of the Daily Crescent, an independent paper in New Orleans. But after 3 months, he was dismissed, possibly because of his careless writing. Returning to New York, he began editing another paper. His failures as a journalist had not yet well convinced him that he was mistaking his career. When he was 30, he was in charge of the Brooklyn Freeman, and this Free Soil journal soon shifted its political course. Since Whitman was not active enough to turn with it, he withdrew in September 1849. As a freelance, Whitman wrote for New York Evening Post and the Advertiser. He became a metropolitan bohemian, and then he began to write the book which was to be his life work. The 1855 Leaves of Grass was an epoch-making volume, but it made its first appearance as a poorly printed pamphlet of 12 poems brought out anonymously and bearing, instead of a signature, a portrait of the author, with one hand in his pocket, the other on his hip, the characteristic open shirt, and a slouch hat rakishly tilted. Reviewers generally greeted the work with bafflement, and frequently with hostility. The London Critic, for example, suggested in its April 1st, 1856 review that the author deserves nothing so richly as the public executioner's whip. In order to balance the negative reviews, Whitman even published self-penned reviews anonymously. An American bard at last, he claimed in the United States Review. Fortunately, one of the first copies of the pamphlet was sent to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote the famous letter of July 22, 1855, praising the young writer, and called the book the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed, concluding, "I give you joy of your free and brave thought. I have great joy in it. I find incomparable things said incomparably well. I greet you at the beginning of a great career, which yet must have had a long foreground somewhere for such a start. When Whitman published his first edition of Leaves of Grass, on or around the 4th of July 1855, he believed that he had engaged in a personal lyric journey of national significance. Setting out to define the American experience, Whitman consciously hoped to answer Emerson's call for a truly original national poet, one who would sing of the new country in a new voice. Although he had published only a small handful of poems before 1855, Whitman felt confident that the time was ripe and the people would embrace him. His confidence resulted largely from his awareness of the tremendous changes of the American lyric world that had taken place during the first half of the 19th century. By 1855, America could boast one of the world's largest and most advanced publishing industries, producing distinctly American books by such writers as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and Edgar Allan Poe. The amazing growth of American literature and of the supporting publishing industry was the result of the self-conscious efforts by authors and publishers to establish for the United States a lyric culture of its own. Between 1830s and 50s, the number of American newspapers grew from 36 to 254. The advent of modern publishing practices during this period brought books and newspapers to people in unimaginable numbers. Working as a printer, editor, journalist, and publisher during the years of the publishing industry's phenomenal growth, Whitman became a bohemian observer of the society and was keenly aware that the tools for his emergence as a new and democratic poet were near at his hands. His experience as a journalist was an important background experience because it was a direct exposure to society. So we see nothing bookish in Whitman's education, and this is perhaps the way he learned about the American society. A new medium, as a result, fostered a new profession with its own personality. Whitman believed that he could bring poetry to common people. With the publication of his 1855 Leaves of Grass, Whitman assumed for himself the role of a new American poet, referring to himself as Walt Whitman, an American, one of the roughs, a cosmos.